38 studios have been sold. We're told the sale of the intellectual property from 2 video games developed by Curt Schilling's defunct company marks the end of the receivership case in Rhode Island.
More money is spent on video games today than on movie tickets. Former baseball star creating jobs, bringing America back.
February 7th, 2012. The game Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning was released on the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and Windows. Developed by Big Huge Games and published by 38 Studios. The game was extremely successful, selling 1.3 million copies the first 90 days and generating a lot of positive reviews from critics and average gamers. Fast forward to 3 months later, and 38 Studios officially declared bankruptcy, ceasing operations and laying off its entire staff of around 400 employees by an email message that was sent to everyone. So the question is, what exactly happened? How did a brand new gaming company that released its first successful video game went bankrupt only a few months later? The person responsible is this guy. Let me explain. This man right here is Curt Schilling. Before Curt Schilling got into the video game business, he was a Major League Baseball right-handed pitcher for 20 years. He played on a total of 5 teams. He helped lead the Phillies to the World Series in 1993. He was also involved with the Diamondbacks in winning the championship. He also won the World Series with the Red Sox in 2004 while having an injury on his right ankle and 2 bloody socks. The man achieved All-Star 6 times and World Series MVP. He was an absolute legend in MLB. Towards the end of his baseball career, Curt Schilling was able to collect around $114 million over the course of playing 2 decades of baseball, and he wanted to achieve his lifelong goal of starting up and managing a video game company. Curt Schilling was extremely focused and ambitious. He wanted to create an MMORPG that would overtake World of Warcraft. He wanted his company to be the next Silicon Valley of the East Coast. He said, and I quote, "I want to become Bill Gates rich." Whenever Curt Schilling teammates wanted to go to the bar or hit the clubs right after a baseball game, Curt Schilling would be spending his time playing EverQuest on his 15-pound laptop. The reason for that is, he wasn't interested in jeopardizing his marriage by going to parties right after the game, so his computer became his outlet. This isn't the first time baseball players become obsessed with video games. In 2019, the Boston Red Sox banned Fortnite in the MLB clubhouse because the players have video monitors installed in their lockers, and the managers saw this as being highly unproductive. The Phillies also had a Fortnite problem too, which resulted in Carlos Santana smashing a TV with a bat after raging in a game. Anyways, back in 2005, Curt Schilling saw the popularity of the subscription-based game World of Warcraft, and later on during the year, Curt Schilling talked to a guy named Bill Thomas, and Curt pitched his idea of building an MMORPG from the ground up. This was later known as Project Copernicus. In 2006, Curt Schilling announced his plans to 6 of his gaming friends, and they liked the idea. In very little time, the massive project started. The gaming studio headquarters would be in Maynard, Massachusetts, and the name of the studio would be called Green Monster Games in September of 2006. No relation to the Green Monster at Fenway Park according to Curt Schilling, but shortly after, it got renamed to 38 Studios because of its jersey number. As soon as Curt Schilling started his business, he wanted to hire some of the top talented game designers in America to help work for him. He wanted to create a utopian office where people feel engaged with their job and not make it seem like a 9-to-5. Curt Schilling has some wild ideas. He wanted every new employee to get their own company car for work. He also wanted his first game at 38 Studios to have over hundreds and hundreds of hours of gameplay when it officially launches. Usually in the video game industry, people start out with designing short indie games or a single player game with 10 to 15 hours of gameplay to start out with. But Curt Schilling wanted to go straight into the MMORPG development. Some people saw this as ambitious, other people saw it as reckless. But since Curt Schilling was able to go to the World Series multiple times and help win the Red Sox the World Championship, a team that has been cursed for many years, Curt felt like he could accomplish anything, and that included making an MMORPG with no experience whatsoever. By the time Curt Schilling officially left baseball in 2008, he already had 60 developers working at 38 Studios for his new MMORPG game. While the company kept on growing over time, Curt Schilling was already starting to spend too much money. He was going around to different locations talking to investors to potentially see if they can help fund 38 Studios. But this plan did not work out at all. Even with Curt Schilling's name and famous background as a top pitcher during his career wasn't enough to persuade investors to help him out. The video game industry was already risky enough to put money into, but to invest into a brand new game studio by a former baseball player with no video game development experience who wanted to challenge World of Warcraft, investors quickly turned that down. Investors did see Curt Schilling as being passionate for his game studio, but also seeing him as being overly confident. By 2009, Curt Schilling was planning on only investing $5 million in his game studio, but instead it became much more expensive. But in March of 2009, Curt Schilling was presented with an opportunity that might help out his company in the long run. The video game developer THQ was struggling and looking into getting rid of its developing studios, Big Huge Games, located in Baltimore, Maryland. Big Huge Games was working on the single-player RPG. If Curt Schilling bought Big Huge Games, they could finish making the RPG game, sell it to the public, and make enough money to finish up their own MMORPG game. And it later on became official on May 27, 2009 that 38 Studios purchased Big Huge Games and would keep 70 of its employees. By the end of 2009, they struck a deal with EA to publish the game and would be known as Kingdoms of Emular Reckoning. EA made a $35 million commitment to the project. This was good for Curt Schilling since he didn't have to pay the employees himself. But still, the MMORPG Copernicus still needed investors to help publish it, or Curt Schilling would go bankrupt. Time was slowly running out. Meanwhile, back in Massachusetts, 38 Studios employees were feeling the pressure. World of Warcraft is still growing with new players. Final Fantasy XIV was entering the market, and EA Star Wars The Old Republic was on its way. The competition was getting out of hand, but Curt Schilling wanted to keep expanding 38 Studios. Curt Schilling made a suggestion in transforming the office employees to work in baseball shifts, which basically means showing up at the office 14 days in a row and then take 5 days off. This idea was shut down by executives before he even started. Things got even more crazier. Curt Schilling was also known for emailing employees at the last minute to change something in the game, which made everyone stop what they were doing and go back to square one to write design documents. By the year 2010, Curt Schilling invested $30 million in his own game, Copernicus, but it wasn't even close to being finished, and Curt was still not getting any investors on board with his new game. Meanwhile, in Rhode Island, the governor at the time, Donald Carcieri, was struggling against the small state more jobs. That's when Donald Carcieri met up with Curt Schilling. Curt was holding a fundraiser event at his mansion for a World War II documentary, and that's when the two men went over the plans for 38 Studios. Curt Schilling wanted $75 million to help fund for his company. In return, he'll relocate his company to Rhode Island instead of Massachusetts, and a promise of creating 450 new jobs in 3 years. Donald Carcieri agreed to it, but this put even more pressure on Curt Schilling. He hasn't produced any games yet, plus he has 10 years to pay off the $75 million loan. In 2012, there was also a hiring freeze at the company and no new salary increases for anyone that got promoted or just simply wanted a raise. Everyone at the company knew that 38 Studios was running out of money. And this came at a really bad time. In 2012, paid subscriptions for MMORPG games were slowly starting to decline. A lot of players didn't want to pay $10 or $15 a month on a game. The future of gaming was now free to play with microtransactions. With all the chaos going around in 38 Studios, there was a bit of good news. On February 7, 2012, 38 Studios released the game Kingdoms of Emular Reckoning, a single-player RPG, and Big Huge Games was developing in the last few years. But this was also a bit of bad timing. 3 months ago, Skyrim was released to the public and that game was getting all the hype and attention. To make things worse, Kingdom of Emular sold only 1.3 million copies. It wasn't enough to cover the production costs for 38 Studios. And on May 1st, 2012, 38 Studios missed its first bank loan repayment. And on May 15th, 2012, all 379 employees learned that they weren't getting paid. Everything was now in full dysfunction. Employees started not showing up to work. News organizations and the press were staying outside the game studio, trying to get an interview or any information from the staff. A lot of game developers started bringing home office equipment. Since they weren't getting paid, they might as well start taking office equipment from the facility. There wasn't enough security to stop the madness. And finally, on May 24th, 2012, an email was sent to all 38 Studios employees stating that a company layoff was in full effect, starting today. The employees were in full shock. No severance package, no repayment of lost wages, nothing on their final paycheck. Healthcare and other benefits are gone. So how did this happen? Well, let's go back to this man, Curt Schilling. Bankruptcy files later revealed that the company funds were not being used correctly. Curt Schilling spent at least $40,000 on travel expenses using company money. Executives at 38 Studios, including Bill Thomas, who was Curt Schilling's wife's uncle, got over $400,000 in total compensation from 38 Studios' final years of operations. So the big problem was executives obtaining large sums of money while game designers got screwed to the very end. The game designers had to resell their home in Massachusetts while looking for a new job. A lot of employees went back to California and Seattle to look for work. Curt Schilling's vision for an MMORPG that could take on World of Warcraft had failed in the long run. 38 Studios is the most interesting, wild, and probably the craziest game studio in the history of video games that somehow was able to get a $75 million loan from the smallest state in the United States of America and not be able to launch the game Copernicus. As of August of 2021, 38 Studios employees began receiving portions of their due salaries. The range would be between 14 to 20% of what they were to make prior to the bankruptcy. As always, thanks for watching.